So example 9.1.2. So now we're going to look at the confidence interval for the two population proportions. So for this should be the difference between the two population proportions. So again, the same story that we just had that we're going to look at again, only now we're going to estimate the difference in the proportion using a 95% confidence level. Okay, so our first step is to state the parameters, which is exactly what we just did in the last problem, so they're already filled in here. So again, P1 is still going to be the proportion of all husbands who cheat, P2 is still going to be the proportion of all wives who cheat, and so P hat 1 is going to be the proportion of the 1,000 randomly selected husbands who cheat. So again, that's a random variable that will vary from one sample to another. We have a particular count in this sample, but again, that will vary from sample to sample. And our random variable P hat 2 is the proportion of 1,200 randomly selected wives who cheat. All of the assumptions we already checked in the last problem, so we're not going to, and they're the same assumptions, so we're not going to do that again. And so the third step is now to name the procedure. So in this case, we are going to look at the two proportion Z interval, since we want a confidence interval now. So again, proportions because we're dealing with qualitative data, 2, because we've got two groups of data. And the Z tells us we're using Z-scores from a normal distribution. All right. So again, a fourth step in PANIC is the interval. And we're going to start first with, again, those point estimates before we look at the interval estimate. So again, the husband data, we had P hat 1 was 0.231. For the wife data, we got P hat 2 was the 0.146666 and rounded off to 7, which means the point estimate for this difference between P1 and P2 is the difference that we saw in the samples. And again, it's an estimate. We know it's not going to be exactly this value. But if we take and subtract those two values, we got the 0.0843. Okay. So now we want a confidence interval for this P1 minus P2. Okay, so again, remember from before, we're going to start with some point estimate. And then around that point estimate, we're going to look at a confidence interval. Okay. And in this case, that interval is for not a single parameter, but the difference between two parameters. All right, so again, if we go into 2 prop Z interval now instead of Z test and type in our x1, n1, x2, n2, and next to confidence level, we're going to put in 0.95 and hit calculate. And on the output screen, that very first line here is our interval. So a 95% confidence interval for P1 minus P2 is this interval that runs from about 0.051 to 0.117 if we round off to 3 decimal places. All right, and so our last step here is the conclusion in context. All right, so this is where our concluding statements get really wacky sometimes. So this is a difference. Okay. We're looking at the difference between P1 and P2. And so these are both positive numbers. So this goes back to thinking about the money example where I had $10 and you had $4. So 10 minus 4 is 6. Okay, so that 6 doesn't represent how much money I have, and it doesn't represent how much money you have. It was the difference between them. And because it was positive, it meant I had $6 more than you did. 10 is 6 more than 4. So in this case, this tells me that P1 is bigger than P2, because these are both positive, by an amount in this interval. So we are going to say we are 95% confident that the proportion of all husbands who cheat is between 0.051 and 0.117 more than the proportion of all wives who cheat. And again, normally when we see these published in newspaper type things, usually instead of proportion they use percentage. So every place we have proportion here, we could replace that with the word percentage, which means our endpoints here, we would rewrite these as 5.1% and 11.7%. Okay. So again, these intervals take some time to get used to, but I want you, every time you go to interpret one of these, think about the example of just 10 minus 4 is 6, means 10 is 6 more than 4, and 4 minus 10 is negative 6, means 4 is 6 less than 10. Okay, so again, here we're taking a difference, and it's positive. That means P1 is bigger than P2 by an amount in this interval.